everyone to this year's Jacobson Family Sustainable Impact Lecture Series. My name is Christina Fialho, and I'm the Managing Director of the Brittingham Social Enterprise Lab, which is a center at USC Marshall that's building an ecosystem of students and professionals equipped with the business skills and resources to advance market-based approaches to pressing societal issues. And I'm really excited to just jump right into today's topic, which is best practices for designing products for communities impacted by social challenges. And I know that's sort of a mouthful, but we're hoping to really explore the disconnect that sometimes exists between those who are actually designing the products or services and the beneficiaries or users of those products and services. We'll also be diving a bit into how to measure social impact, because for us at the lab, we believe that designing products and measuring their social impact are really two sides of the same coin. And this is our fifth panel discussion in our series this academic year on the theme of how businesses are centering community and social impact. And I want to take a quick moment to thank the Jacobson family for endowing this annual series, as well as my wonderful team here at the Brittingham Social Enterprise Lab. So if you as an audience member have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. And I'm going to do my best to pose some of these questions to the panelists towards the end of the hour. But feel free to not be shy and to use that chat function. So I want to jump right in and introduce our amazing panelists here. We have Dr. Sophie Bacq, who is the Larry and Barbara Sharp Associate Professor of Entrepreneurship at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. She's taught and conducted empirical research on social entrepreneurship across the world, in Europe, here in the United States, and South Africa. She's also the editor or on the editorial review board of multiple academic journals, and she is the co-director of the annual Social Entrepreneurship Conference, along with our very own Dr. Jill Kickle here at USC. Shalaka Gole is the Senior Product Manager, and I think I pronounced your name wrong. Can you pronounce your name again?
Shalaka.
Shalaka, okay, I want to make sure I get that right. Shalaka Gole is the Senior Product Manager at Code for America, where she works directly with state agencies on improving their benefits experiences. And actually in 2021, her team launched and scaled a statewide application for 9 benefits programs, including SNAP and childcare in Minnesota, which I'm really excited to hear more about today. Previously, she worked at Tala as a product manager, launching a microcredit product for India and building repayment tools for teams across the world in Kenya, the Philippines, and Mexico. She also graduated from USC with her BS in Business Administration, where she was one of our Brittingham Social Enterprise Scholars. So welcome back. Shirin Laor-Raz Salemnia is the founder and CEO of PlayWerks, which is an interactive media company that creates immersive games and experiences. And she's really a thought leader and tech giant, if you don't already know her. She's been awarded the LA City Pioneer Women of the Year Award, Tribeca Disruptor Innovation Fellowship, and the IJWO Woman of the Year Award. So I really want to start off by grounding us in shared language around the concept of design thinking. And here at the lab, we believe that design thinking is really a fundamental skill set in social entrepreneurship education. So I really want to start this off with you, Sophie. If you could, share a little bit more about what design thinking is for our audience, and then share what some of the latest management and entrepreneurship research show when it comes to designing solutions for communities impacted by social challenges. So I'll turn over to you, Sophie.
Great questions, Christina. Thank you so much first for having me, and thank you to your team. And it's wonderful to be in such a spectacular company. So I can't wait to learn from Shirin and Shalaka in a few minutes. So I will share a little bit of the conceptual background on design thinking, which I also have applied in the classroom, and I'm sure I'm not the only one here on the call, and that is probably applied or hopefully applied in the practice world as well. So you mentioned it's a set of skills and tools, Christina, So I view it as a non-linear. That's very important because that shakes a little bit of the linearity that we see in traditional classes, especially at the business school. So it's a process that's both non-linear and iterative, right? So constantly trying to rethink potential solutions to address the issues that are experienced by the users or the communities, as you mentioned. So a nonlinear iterative process of innovation that has a few characteristics in my mind. The first is it's inherently human-centered, right? So the goal is to really understand the users and the problem from the perspective of the user, right? So not only understanding the user themselves, but what in the problem do they see as most pressing to address. It also has the particularity, second, to challenge assumptions, right? Because you can think you have the best ideas in the world, and the latest research shows that the best intentions, and in practice, sadly, you see that as well, the best intentions do not lead to necessarily always the best intended outcomes, right? And so challenging intentions, revisiting assumptions is really a second characteristic of design thinking. The third is directly related, is this idea of redefining constantly the problem until you really understand it from the perspective of the user and get validation, give voice to the user so that they can share what they perceive as being the problem. And finally, creating an innovative solution, because oftentimes design thinking is applied in the context of social change to ill-defined problems or unknown problems, right? And so there is going to be inherent innovation that is part of the design thinking process. It has five stages, as many of you may know. It starts with empathy. We can talk about that as well if you want it. I mean, if that's relevant for the experience of Shirin and Shalaka. It starts with empathy, which is a huge concept as well in the social entrepreneurship academic literature, which is where I focused most of my work in the past 15 years. You empathize, you define, you ideate, you come up with solutions, and then you prototype and you test, and you're not done there. You test once, and if it's not perfect, which is unlikely it will be the first time, you kind of go back to the empathy or go back to another step in the cycle. So that's how I see it pretty shortly. The latest research really emphasizes that communities, sadly, have played mostly very passive roles when it comes to social innovation design. So they're oftentimes seen as, the beneficiary, but in a way that is absolutely not inclusive. So I'm not saying, I'm hoping the practice is better and moving forward towards better inclusion, but in the research I recently reviewed, so there was more than 200 academic articles published in the past 15 years. Inclusion of target users and community was fairly limited. Yet the research also highlighted that there are instances where communities adopt more agentic roles, so contributing resources, insights, ideas to the innovation or innovative solution development. And such, I wrote down one finding here, which is that involving community members in the framing and the design enhances both the legitimacy of the social venture and likely its ability to serve the social cause. So I think the paradigm is shifting in that direction. We're realizing there needs to be more inclusion, but oftentimes it's not the case because it's time consuming and costly, and social entrepreneurs tend to be, constrained when it comes to time and resources. So that's a little bit of an introduction, but any reactions from Shalaka and Shirin, I'd love to hear them. We can continue the conversation.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you so much, Sophie. I think we don't usually stop to think about how the way in which products and services are designed really has a tremendous impact on our lives. And this is probably because very few of us participate actually in the design process, which is what you were kind of highlighting. And more importantly, the communities who are most adversely affected by design decisions tend to have the least influence on those decisions. I'm glad to hear we're kind of seeing a shift there. But I'd love to turn to you, Shalaka. You've worked in the state of Minnesota to design benefits programs, which must be quite difficult also, like working with a big bureaucracy like the government. Can you share how you engaged those impacted by the benefits in your design work? And what is your approach when the product or service is built with or for the government?
Yeah, it's definitely complicated, like you acknowledged. I think a couple of examples of times that we've done this well, and then I'd also love to talk about like where I think we have room to grow as an organization. So we have, design research, qualitative research as an embedded part of our design process. So before we even said as an engagement with the state of Minnesota, hey, we're going to rebuild a benefits application, we talked to caseworkers in counties kind of across the state. And we met with people that were participants in SNAP and childcare and Medicaid to try to just understand like, what is the, problem? Where is the big question? So, like from the very beginning of the process, trying to understand from people that are lived experts, like, hey, on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis, how does this show up in your life? And I think also something that we try to do, and this is also something that I think we have room to grow in, is like acknowledging the power dynamic that often exists in design thinking. Like, we are technologists, and I work for an organization called Code for America that's based in San Francisco, and I live in LA, and like, I have a degree from USC, and yet here I am working on SNAP and Medicaid. I'm definitely not a participant in SNAP and Medicaid. And so there's like an inherent power dynamic to that. And so constantly trying to figure out how to balance that power dynamic. A couple of examples of ways that we've tried to do that. We try to do co-design and like participatory decision-making when it's possible. So for example, this past year, I've been working with the state of Minnesota on Medicaid renewals, and that's a really big open design problem. And there's a lot of different people that are affected by this in different ways. And so when we were trying to decide what are the things we're going to spend our time and energy and money on, we did a participatory prioritization workshop where there were community health workers, healthcare navigators, caseworkers, state policy people at the state that work on, like equity analysis. And those navigators sort of were the voice of, Medicaid participants, and tried to make and succeeded in making like a collective prioritization decision, rather than us as Code for America being like, hey, we know what's what, like, here's what we think we need to do. We sort of set up a workshop and we're like, you tell us, you're the experts. We're just the people that are going to try to make what you think is important happen. And we went in with an opinion, of course, and then went out realizing like, oh, we thought that a online renewal form would really be helpful. And, there were split decision-making, split opinions about that. And I might be getting a little into the weeds here, but yeah, basically like a participatory part of the process at really key moments, like when you're trying to ask the question, what's important to do, when you're trying to decide what is the thing that we're actually going to do, and then actually in the process of designing it. So the last example I'll talk about is there. So, as we were building this website for Minnesota, this application website, in Minnesota, there are counties that administer benefits, and then there are also tribal servicing agencies run by the sovereign tribal nations that are within sort of the Minnesota state boundaries. And we needed to incorporate an application, flow for people applying for a particular tribal program. And there's a lot of complications in terms of like who gets it and who administers it and all of that. And so before we built it, we like went and sat with them for days on end, and we're like, how would you want this to go? What's the right way to ask this question? What does this make you feel? And we did that with tribal servicing agency caseworkers, and we also did that with members of the tribal nation. And so, co-designing, like putting screens in front of them, but then also giving them a pen and paper and being like, okay, if this doesn't work, like, what would you do? So those are all the ways I think, like at the very beginning, during decision-making, and then also when you're actually like in the weeds of screens and buttons and, implementation, making sure that people who are lived experts have a voice and like a meaningful voice. And then I think the last thing I'll say, the like limitations or maybe the room to grow here is that there are many points in the process where you kind of have to run with it, or there isn't space or time to, you know, like evaluate policy both ways. And so still, I think me as a product manager on a team that works on something like this, I'm just constantly trying to ask myself and my team that question of like, can we bring in lived experts here if we don't have that knowledge?
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for raising that. And specifically, I love how you talked about power dynamics, because I don't think it's something we talk enough about in these spaces, but it's so foundational to any topic involving social impact, social justice, social issues. So thank you for raising that. Shirin, I want to turn to you because you're working with truly the next generation children. And can you share why you developed PlayWerks as a founder and as a social entrepreneur, and how you engage users in the design experience?
Sure. Well, Christina, I just want to say thank you for having me, and I'm in an esteemed company, so thank you again. Yeah, so I think this is fascinating because it starts with I had a dream job. I wanted to be like Tom Hanks in the movie Big. So I started out in research on Barbie, and we had design thinking all day long, figuring out what works, what doesn't work, from ideation to the end. And I did that for 3 years. And then I got the itch to go back to school. And I was like, well, what do I want to do? Do I want to do business? Because I originally majored in child psychology. And I ended up at MGA starting the research department, and within 6 months being the brand manager for Bratz. And that was like my live MBA school for 5 years. And it was phenomenal because I got to hear parents coming in every day and talking about how Barbie and Bratz were not positive role models for their daughter. And it got me really thinking, and not just in focus groups at work, but like in social settings. When I would say I had a dream job, I wanted to be like Tom Hanks in the movie Big, people would look at me and be like, that's cool, but is that a real job? And I was like, I don't know, Mattel's only, you know, they're only Fortune 500 companies. But it really got me thinking, and I was like, what am I doing on this planet? Like, I started to have an existential crisis, and I even heard Spider-Man was evil in a social setting. I was like, okay, I had nothing to do with Spider-Man, but this is like the icing on the cake. So I started to really look back and see like, what can we do to make a difference for girls specifically in the 8 to 13 age range? And at the time, there was tons of articles I was finding about STEM and how there's still not anything like relevant for girls in that age range. And it was fascinating because, again, I had the research background and also the brand management and like building an entertainment franchise. And I was like, okay, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to go back to my roots, which was gaming. And I actually grew up in LA, and I was obsessed with like Atari 2600 and Nintendo. And then at school, I went to LAUSD public school right down the street from the other school, UCLA in Westwood. And I had a female computer science teacher in the 80s that taught me how to code Fortran on an Apple IIc green screen with Carmen Sandiego every single day. And I was like, the game that I was obsessed with was Carmen Sandiego. And why can't I make a game similar to that, but focus on STEM? And that's how PlayWerks was born. And we've been doing design thinking ever since. And then, so WizGirls is the name of the game. We're not officially launched yet, we're in beta. And then through the process, as I mentioned in the chat, like I got invited to the Tech for Obama campaign and the re-election and all the things. And they were like, you should do coding for kids. And I was like, no, I already have a tech startup that I'm focused really big on social impact. I can't do another thing. So it kept coming back and forth. And that's technically how WizGirls Academy was born. And that's where we do the hackathons with the kids that is all about design thinking, because we're giving them the tools and we're teaching them how to code. We're teaching them meditation, fitness, healthy eating. And at the end of the day, they pitch like Shark Tank style to real investors. So I think design thinking has literally been part of my process from the beginning, from my previous dream job to now running my startups. And even when I was teaching at USC, I was still implementing that because I think it's huge and it's really important.
Oh, thank you so much. What an incredible journey, and a fun one too at that. I want to read out something that one of our audience members, Shari McLean says. She says, so important to understand that the designer isn't the expert, but truly the user. I love that. And for us at the lab, integration of design thinking in management education and social entrepreneurship teaching is really becoming increasingly popular and an important tool in real world application-based learning. And I want to do a shout out to Dr. Jill Kickle here at the lab, who recently published a paper in entrepreneurship education and pedagogy where she and her co-researchers underscored and really looked at how historically social entrepreneurship and business education really more generally relied more heavily on, quote, rational analytical approaches to problem solving. But this really can fall short in a world that is more complex and unpredictable. And I think that's what you were kind of getting at, Sophie, and sharing more about when you spoke earlier. So I want to turn back to you to hear more about your research. And my question to you is, from your research, what have you found to be some of the lenses and or maybe guiding principles that social entrepreneurs and innovators can apply when making decisions to design for communities?
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. This is already a very rich conversation. I will try to add a few bits and pieces from my research, but I'd love to go back at some point to discuss the power dynamics question that Shalaka raised, and I think it is under our research actually, so I don't have the answers there, but I think there's a lot of questions to be posed, and I'd love to learn from the practice. In terms of lenses, there are two that I'm thinking about. One is pretty established in political economy, and is actually issued from the work of Elinor Ostrom, who is the first woman who won the Nobel Prize in economics, and she's passed away now, but she made her own career at Indiana University. She started at UCLA, so it's like connecting the dots because I'm based here at Indiana these days. And so she wrote a book that, a couple of books, and an amazing body of work. She really looks at the concepts and the problems that are involved in collective action, right? Which is coming back in social entrepreneurship. We realize that social entrepreneurs need to partner with others to solve the problems. It's not a one-person show that's going to have all of the solutions, including the users for sure, but probably getting advice from supporters and people who've been there. And so in collective action, she's trying to show how communities manage their own shared resources, and showing that there are different ways of organizing that are neither just a state, a government response, or just a market response. And in that work, she raises the concept of co-production. And I see a lot of parallels between co-production and co-design, and I think Shalaka maybe even mentioned co-production in her sharing earlier. And so I think that's one lens that is coming back to the fore of the conversation. To me, it's very exciting because I keep learning. I'm out of my depth because it's not business school management, traditional learnings that you would learn within the walls of a business school. But as Jill mentioned, these problems that we're all here, discussing and trying to tackle, they really require, they're complex, so they require many more tools. It cannot be just a rational process. Thank you, Christina, for the pitch of Jill's excellent article. It's just not rational. It's not just causal. There's going to be a lot of multiple actors at multiple levels engaging in finding the solution. And so the first thing I want to mention is co-production by Elinor Ostrom, and the fact that even if universities are highly siloed, I encourage everyone interested in the space in reaching out and branching out beyond the walls of one's school, and to learn from community development and sociology, and even energy management. There's a lot of things we can learn from other disciplines, is my first point. The second one is more work I am involved in and leading directly, which is based on the argument that to really move the conversation forward when it comes to design for social impact, we need to think at the community or civic, what we call the civic level of analysis. Thanks for nodding, Shalaka. That gives me confidence. And I'm saying this because, I'm a little theoretical when I speak, so I hope I'm intelligible enough. But I'm saying this because, you know, in most of our research, we think social entrepreneur. Well, we think these individuals here on the call, right? So we think individual. Let's research what's so special about Shirin and Shalaka that, you know, is making them change the world and having a positive, you know, legacy on this planet. But it's more than that. And then researchers started looking at the organization, right? So let's study how they structure their organizations, how they make decisions, you know, how they form teams and so on. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the impact, it really matters to adopt this civic or community level of analysis. And when you do that, you actually, you know, you step away from, you know, the leader of the organization or the organizational structure and being, again, very formal and maybe rigid. And you look at the problem more from a, you know, a bird's eye view, if you will. And by doing that, what I'm trying to propose with my work is looking at the collective action, the collaboration between entrepreneurs, between communities of users themselves, and between supporters, and seeing how collectively they're designing the solutions that will last and have a lasting positive impact.
Thank you so much, Sophie. I think what your definition also is getting at is that power dynamic. And I know you mentioned wanting to speak a little bit more of that. So I definitely want to open the space to more of a discussion, which Shalaka brought up, because I think you know, a core principle of design justice is prioritizing design impact on the community over the intentions of the designer, which I think is part of the power dynamic that can be in play. So yeah, I just want to open up the discussion on that, and then maybe we'll jump into some challenges of measuring some of these the successes of these designs.
I don't know if I have answers, but scattered thoughts on like passing power. I think the fact that any of these practices exist is within the context of, you know, an inequitably organized world. So any of us trying to do anything social impact related, whether it's social entrepreneurship or nonprofit models, like, and civic tech models like Code for America, it's sort of like, okay, this exists because the world has been, you know, inequitably organized. And so you exist in this sort of messed up ecosystem as like an individual or like group actor. And I think just one thing that was helpful to me was acknowledging that and just being like, I'm not going to fix all of that. I'm just an actor, an individual actor within an organization that has a limited scope, and that's okay because that's just the world. And then I think after acknowledging that is like constantly asking, like, how can I pass the power? If I have power and there are people that are more impacted by this than I am, or have more expertise in this than I am, and often it's both together, then how can I pass the power? So is there, and one other thing that I was thinking about, Sophia, as you were talking about, you know, like engaging, you know, the civic and community space, to me, that fits in the category of like existing opportunities. When you think about, when you learn about design thinking, it's sort of like, what opportunities are there? And that to me is an example of an existing opportunity. So for our work in Minnesota, for example, it's like, okay, there are community health centers. They are lived experts, you know, whether it's someone going to the community health center or someone administering care or someone who's helping, you know, with the social work process, trying to get someone on Medicaid. Like they're all, you know, existing experts that can be brought into a process, or caseworkers, I think, are a huge part of our work in the benefits space. You know, often they live and work and exist in communities that are also participants in programs. And so, and they, you know, live and breathe this hour to hour, day to day. So how can we bring them in? So I think that question of like, who maybe doesn't have the power that I do and how can I pass it is like an interesting question that I try to ask in our team, and maybe one that can be repeated.
Wonderful. That's super thoughtful answer. So thank you so much for helping us uncover some more of the power dynamics that are at play here. And I think, like I was saying, I think these power dynamics really play into how we measure our social impact, because when we set goals around a certain project, we actually work towards, obviously, those goals. And so having the users or the beneficiaries, so to speak, also designing those goals, I think is really critical to this discussion and to breaking down those power dynamics. So I'd actually love to hear from you again, Shalaka, because it sounds like what you were working on in Minnesota was not just product design, but also a systems intervention. And you spoke about this a little bit, because I think systems change interventions typically require a concerted effort over a long period of time. But one of the challenges you mentioned earlier and that I've encountered in my work is that while the timeline of progress in the social impact sector is slow, the funding available or the contracts with the government can be short-term and really outcomes focused. So I'd love to hear if you've encountered this with your work, or what you have, or any other challenges or limitations to measuring the impact of your product or service. And then I'm going to also open it up to Shirin and Sophie, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, clarifying question. You're just sort of wondering, how do we think about measuring impact within these constraints?
Yeah, and any challenges that you've faced in measuring that impact. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think constant, challenge of question, something that helps us narrow focus on, being able to measure this impact at Code for America is that we're focused on metrics that directly impact the person that we're trying to design with or for. And so, if we're building a benefits application or doing a benefits service intervention, at the end of the day, we're sort of like, how many people are getting benefits, or how many people are keeping their benefits, and constantly sort of coming back to, how does X piece of work or, Y activity contribute or not contribute to that end goal. So having that sort of thing articulated, constantly repeated, like that's our North Star, is like, is this helping people get or keep benefits? And then I think other things that are important in the structuring of the project and like doing the work, we do try to do longer running contracts. So, I've worked with the state of Minnesota for 2 years, but in total, they've had a partnership with the Organization of Code for America for 3+. And at the end of the contract, it'll have been, I think, 4.5 years. So, not expecting that we're going to show up, build a cool website and, like have it work and then be like, cool, that was great. Like expecting that that's going to take time for distributing that knowledge and making sure we're taking into account, the 3,000 plus workers in the state that will be using the outputs of that thing. And so building that into the way that things work. And then I think some of it, I mean, challenges in measurement, it has, my brain goes in a million different directions. I think trying as much as possible to, if you can't have quantitative data about like, okay, we can't quite connect the dots, like we're not getting access to the data that we need, it's hidden behind, this government red tape, or we can't get access to the technological system, like how can we use qualitative data? Because I think qualitative can be such a powerful way to learn about whether something is working or not working, even if it's not, at scale or whatever. If you can do a range of qualitative research that's like, hey, how is this impacting the subset of people? I think that can be a really good way to keep checking in on whether or not you're having the impact that you're trying to have. And then I think lastly is being open to when the answer is that you're not, and being like organizationally and personally, putting the ego down of, hey, actually we built this thing, it's not working. We had that experience when we were trying to incorporate that tribal nations flow. We were sending it to the wrong people. We were basically setting the tribal nations up for failure. And they said that to us. And, we had to be open to being like, we messed up. And now we need to like hear your feedback and work with you more closely so that we can be changing that. So I think in summary, qualitative feedback when not possible, having a North Star that's like really clear, and then being open to when the answer is that you're not doing well.
I love that. Yeah, it's important to be humble and know when you need to pivot. So thank you. Shirin, I'd love to hear any thoughts that you have on any key challenges that you've had to overcome or kind of navigate through in measuring social impact.
Yeah, I think the biggest one is, I was enlightened to the issue of STEM for girls in 2005, and this is way before it was like cool, before, the White House was talking about, before will.i.am or anybody was even talking about it. So I was like kind of on the forefront, and I would tell my colleagues in the toy business, I'd be like, there's a huge issue here. They'd all be like, well, there's no money in education. And I mean, social impact didn't really exist at the time. So I was like, being an innovator in the space, it's like the innovator's challenge and dilemma. So that was an issue to deal with for a little while, but I was like, you know what? I think there's something here, because literally every time I hear in qualitative research focus groups from parents, they keep saying we want educational toys and games for our kids, especially girls. And for me, it was kind of like crazy because, like I said, I grew up with a female computer science teacher in the 3rd grade at LAUSD public school. So it was like, wait a minute, what's happening here? Why are we going to the Twilight Zone and going behind? So that was a challenge. But then when I started working, with the different groups and going through the motions and kind of staying on the path, I call it being on the tech yellow brick road, it was very clear, like the kind of mandate from the White House, the Obama administration, was focus on inner city kids and girls because that's who needs it the most. And I was like, okay, this is how we can create the most social impact because these are the ones that need it the most. And we really gamified and like made a really cool project-based learning experience that was very heart-centered. And it's relevant because like if you look at any brand, there's a very deep emotional connection, and it's like having that experience. So like when you come to the hackathon in the mornings, like I would tell the kids, like, you're all super secret agents, you're on a mission to learn how to code, how to meditate, like all these things. And at the end of the day, you're gonna create a business or a company, or like who's gonna be the CEO, think about who's gonna be the coder, and they all have to do all these things to pitch to real investors. And the largest hackathon I did was with Mayor Garcetti and the White House and will.i.am at City Hall. We took over the 10th floor and we had 150 kids. And that was massive because we had 8-year-olds and we had like 16-year-olds. And some of the 8-year-olds in the morning were like freaking out. They were like, I could tell like their body language was like, we don't want to be here. And they started hiding under the tables. And I was like, okay, this is not happening. So I got up on the mic and I said, okay, everyone, we're here to have fun. Like we have like, prizes. We have a hat from 50 Cent that he signed. Like we have all these things. And they all started warming up. And then towards the end of the day, those 8-year-olds that were hiding in under the table were like running after me saying they want to go first. Whereas they didn't even want to be here, but they were all ready to go first because they had this like magical experience that was really, like I said, heart-centered and really about like this emotional connection. This is project-based learning. And it's so interesting to see them like really blossom and get excited about tech and coding and also careers and the pipelines that we create and all of the elements. So I think, and I've always implemented, like we're doing like pre-surveys and post-surveys to see like how they do, but you can tell, like I said, with the body language and how they integrate and how they communicate with each other, it's really fascinating to watch.
I love that. I mean, empathy is the starting point for design thinking. So I love that heart-centered approach that you take. Sophie, do you have any thoughts on any challenges or kind of any connection between design thinking and the actual measurement of the success of those designs?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sure. Thank you, Christina. Yes, I do. I mean, the first I wanted to mention is actually a reaction to what Shalaka and then Shirin just mentioned when it comes to the qualitative and quantitative data. I love to hear that you use both Shalaka and then Shirin as well. You said like we have multiple points in time data collection and qualitative focus groups. And so I wanted to emphasize the complementarity of both, right? So the quantitative will tell you whether or not that's working. The qualitative will tell you why, right? It will really get at the underlying reasons that made your actions be successful for your intended outcomes or not. And so I remember that was one of the challenges that was also mentioned around the randomized control trials that are run by development economists, right? They can they can assess what kind of solution or policy is most effective for their intended outcome. But they rarely, through that more quantitative approach, can say why, right? So it really requires some qualitative, human-centered, human-based, human interaction in the measurement of impact. And so thank you, both of you, for bringing that up, because I think we may be running too quickly towards quantitative data sometimes, and the richness of the qualitative is really, important to, be aware of. I think I definitely see a strong connection between the design thinking principles and the impact measurement, especially when using some of the logic models. I remember Jill taught me that like 13 years ago at NYU Stern, so she must be smiling because I don't see her face. I hope she is. This logic model and this idea of having a direct output that would manifest into a broader, maybe a longer term outcome, and then finally impact. And to me, the whole theory of change logic model really rests on the understanding of the problem from the perspective of the user that one is trying to support or help or assist, right? So if you're I don't know so much about your organization, but if you're proposing these programs, goals, coding, inner city goals, coding, you could measure directly like how many showed up and how many participated, at the end of the day, but you're hoping that this will manifest for higher, better trajectories around, later on in their lifetime. And so you can only do that. You can only set up measurements that make sense if you adopt an empathetic, human-centered approach. I think there is a direct connection, because we talk about the measurement, but there's also the question of what to measure, right? I mean, Shalaka said, like, we do design thinking at different points in time. We, first, like, what is it we need to focus on? Because again, these problems are so multifaceted, right? Otherwise, they had been resolved by now, hopefully. So what facet of the problem should we focus on? What is the kind of solution that you're liking better, that fits your needs? And then you said later on you keep involving in the co-design. And I think the same applies for measurement, right? So you could use also these design thinking approaches to understand, okay, what is the most desired outcome that you see as the user of my service? And in putting that in the impact measurement, I think will make a huge difference. Because one principle I highlighted with design thinking was debunking or forgetting of assumptions. We make assumptions all the time, and so I think trying to be aware that we do so and trying to forget and ask instead is critical for impact definition and then impact measurement.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sophie. So I just want to remind folks that you can feel free to post your questions in the chat function, or you can just chat me directly too. I'm going to start reading off some of these questions as we're 15 minutes to the hour, and I want to make sure I can get all of your questions into our wonderful panelists here. So I'll start off with a question from Mark Spears, and I'm going to direct this one to you, Shirin, but I think it's to everyone because this conversation is so rich, I think. So he asks, how do we introduce the concepts of systems thinking and co-design at a much earlier stage in the education process, specifically at the elementary school, primary education level? It seems like a real opportunity to create a more equitable society with the newest generation as leaders. So you kind of spoke already a little bit about the work that you're doing on this, Shirin, but love to hear any other thoughts you or the other panelists have to this question.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think it goes back to, like, I worked on, like, my focus has always been 8 to 13-year-olds, although I did teach preschool for a minute when I was in college. But I feel like that's the age where everything shifts, and the whole specific for STEM specifically, it goes back to, like, they really need to have something that they feel empowered with and like entertained at the same time. And that's why I think interactive experiences are really fun. And the whole thing about project-based learning, so like sprinkling all the whole secret agent stuff in between really works for us. But I think it comes back to like, you really have to talk to kids on their level. And J.K. Rowling said this really well, and it literally rings in my head always. She was like, you talk to kids on their level or you talk down to them. And if you talk to them on their level, they totally understand and they want to be part of the solution, and they love to solve problems. They're always asking questions and why, right? But if you talk down to them, they're never going to come back to it, because it's not like, you don't hook them, you don't catch their interest. So it's really important to have that experience. So when we were designing everything, and luckily, like I said, I had a research background, it was really important to have that whole emotional experience to come back to, because that's what they really connect with.
That's great. Thank you, Shirin. Any other thoughts from the other panelists to this question? Okay. Yes. I have another question from Joanne Takita, and she says this goes back a little bit in the discussion that we were having, but how can we define community for our projects without casting the net too wide or too narrow? Any thoughts that the panelists may have on this question? So again, I think this is getting at how do we define who we're serving, or who the users or beneficiaries are.
I can speak to it. I speak theoretically, and then I know that Shalaka and Shirin are gonna back me up. But so two elements I want to point out. The first is that in the recent review I mentioned, it was 200 articles across disciplines. So really important for us to get a sense of what entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs are contributing or not, right? In case of negative impact to communities for intended positive societal change. So we actually found 5 different types of community. And so I'm mentioning that first to kind of broaden, maybe you haven't thought about that, and maybe if that's not helpful, that's okay. But when we think community, we're actually, I think, thinking of different things. If everybody had to write it down on a piece of paper at this moment, well, there's obviously community of place, right? So sharing geographies, and then I'll get at the, how do you narrow it down, or what do you set the boundaries? But sharing geography, sharing identity, right? And of course, these can overlap. So I identify as as an LA person, which I do not, but that may be something that I feel, to me, when I visit LA, there's a strong, identity based connection for people who identify and belong in LA. And so that is the second one. There is community of interest. So it's more like sharing interest for social cause. There is community of practice. So these are more relating to profession, but here, in the underprivileged communities that we looked at in the research, they were more like communities of fishermen in remote and impoverished regions of the African continent, for instance. And finally, communities of faith. So you think of faith, F-A-T-E. So communities that are affected by a negative externality, be it a natural disaster. I'm thinking the community of in Turkey with the earthquake a few weeks ago. And so when you think of community, you can think across these layers and also realize that these can overlap or not. So that's one way to define community. And then to me, like, how do you know what's what's appropriate, not too large, but not too niche, not too narrow? Well, I do think that's what I tell my students when we do the design thinking, and they're full of hope and passion and assumptions, trying to solve the world's problems. I do tell them that any entrepreneur starts somewhere, right? And so I think that it's probably, even if they're dreaming about these global, change maker examples, it's probably okay to start pretty contained, geographically speaking. Also, because context is really going to matter and influence the ways that the problem is perceived, experienced, long lasting. And so that is my recommendation in terms of, at least within one geographical boundary, within one country. If it's the United States, probably break it down to huge country, right? So narrow in that sense. But then, is it, do you have to have the 8 to 13? Shirin was saying that, well, I think it depends on the problem. Then you want to, segment depending on, well, we want to have those are the most excluded. Well, that maybe, imply a gender-based kind of segmenting, and then an age-based, and then where you live in the city kind of based criteria. So to me, you can use the problem as the core defining factor for your community segmentation. That's it.
No, that's super helpful. I think always coming back to the problem as a way to kind of guide you to the solution, I think is core. Shirin and Shalaka, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I want to second that. The problem is huge, but also, I don't know if you've heard of Simon Sinek, and he wrote this book called Start With Why, and he was kind of influential when I was questioning what am I doing on this planet. He had the book signing, and I went and I asked him, like, what do you do when you get a dream? And he was like, what's your purpose and why? And I was like, that's a great question. Let me think about that. So it really got me thinking about, like, what am I doing? And it's got to be very focused. So I think it's huge. And I highly recommend that book, and listening to him. He's got a bunch of TED Talks. I would recommend it. It's helpful.
Yeah, +1 to using the problem as the way to figure out who to talk to. And +1 to, Sophie, the thing that you said about, oh man, it literally just fell out of my head. It'll come back to me. But the last thing I would say is, like, once you know what the problem it is that you're working on, I almost am less worried about talking to too many people and more worried about talking to too few. I'd like, especially at the beginning of a project, like, it feels really important to cast a wide net, to make sure that we're getting a varied amount of perspectives of expertise from different angles. And then you can start to narrow together. So then you can ask, what do you think is important? Like, I think Sophie was saying a little bit earlier, like, define impact or measure impact collectively, and then you can narrow. But it feels, it feels more important to ask a wide range, especially at the open, beginning end of starting a series of work.
Yeah, thank you so much. I also know that we have a pretty diverse array of skills and professions represented in our audience today. So not everybody is working, strictly on the design phase of a project. So love to hear from anyone. Maybe I can start off with you, Shalaka. How have you seen different roles on a cross-functional team engaged with design methods, especially if the team members aren't designers?
Yeah. Well, I think a great example is me. I'm not a designer. I, have taken some classes in design methods, and I started my journey in this at USC. I took Professor Abby Pfeiffer-Mendel's Design Thinking for Social Change or something like that class. And I think it's so helpful for many people on a team to be versed in some form of design thinking methods, user-centric methods, because there are always ways in different roles to engage the basic principle of, like, what do I not know that someone else might know better? And how can I use my curiosity to learn what that is? So I think, like, every role on a team can ask that question in their own particular way. So as a product manager, if my job is to prioritize, I can get input from different experts about how to prioritize. I can ask them, how would you define impact? And my job can be to collate that information. If I'm an engineer, then I can do a similar thing. Like, our engineers, when we were working with the state of Minnesota, embedded with Minnesotan engineers that were working for the state government. And they, cross-shared learning. Our engineers were, this is how, agile software development works. But the Minnesota engineers would then teach, this is how the state organizes their IT infrastructure or whatever. So I think in every role, there's a way to be open-ended and curious, and then, look to the people that are the experts of this process and ask them questions about it and see how you can learn from that practice. But I think there's ways for every role to incorporate even just the philosophy of, what do I not know that there is an expert in my community or context that might know a little bit more?
Great guiding principles for us. Thank you. Sophie or Shirin, any thoughts on this question? Okay, I think we have time for one more question. This is kind of a more specific question, but want to make sure we answer this audience member's question. So they write, how do you feel about asking hypothetical questions to the user group?
I can start. So before I was a product manager, I was a qualitative researcher. And so we thought a lot about how this all worked and tend to stray away from it because generally, even if like our imaginary selves can be different from our lived selves. And so often the practice that we had in qualitative research was, can you tell me about the last time that X thing happened? And not like a time, but the most recent time, because often, you know, the way that I hope that I exist is that I wake up every morning and I'm up, 2 hours before my first meeting and I'm journaling and I'm drinking coffee. But how I actually exist is I roll out of bed, and I'm like frantically checking my email and then jumping onto the first Zoom. So, that even just that difference between how I'd like to be and how I am in my personal life is sort of like an illustrative example of how, our imaginary selves and our actual, lived way of interacting with something are different. And so general practice in qual research is ask about something that happened rather than hypothetical.
I see lots of nods from the other participants on here, so that's great. So before I close, I just want to see if anybody has any last parting words, and also if there are websites or Twitter accounts that people can follow you on, if you want to share. So I'll turn it to the panelists here. Maybe we'll start off with Shirin.
Sure. So I really think, I don't want to beat a dead horse with this, but like research is super important, especially with design thinking. And I'm super lucky that that was my background, but I think you got to focus on whenever you're wanting to create something, focus on the end user and really get a feel for what they want, do research with them, listen to them, because they're the ones that ultimately are going to engage with it. And it's super important. And make sure that you really listen, and especially when it's kids, they'll tell you straight up if it's a yes or a no. Like when we did research, we had like things that would cover the toys. And once we took them off, they would be like, oh, that's so cool. Or they'd be like, ew, that's nasty. So it's, very, very clear.
I love it. So engaged children, they'll be honest with us.
Can I share one closing thought? I think we're getting out of time. So I have a quick one, which Shalaka's prior comment made me reflect on when you said like about, collaborating in teams for design. To me, and that's also the title of a book by Berger, is The Power of Asking Questions. It's called The Power of Inquiry. But I think that really sums up what we've been discussing today, really engaging with both, different disciplines from an academic standpoint, different stakeholders when you're designing solutions, in particular, the target communities and target users of the project, and asking questions and engaging with coworkers and people who, who may have the answer to the questions you're asking yourself. So power of asking questions is my closing comment.
Wonderful.
I think my pithy one-liner would be, how can I or my team pass the power using design methods?
Ah, beautiful. Well, on that note, everyone, this concludes today's webinar. Thank you to our amazing panelists here, to all of you who are watching and have been watching this series. This is actually the final panel discussion in our series this academic year. But don't worry, because there's been so much interest. We're going to be hosting a bonus panel on systems change at the start of the summer, potentially in person at USC. So check out our Instagram at USC Brittingham Lab, or join our mailing list to stay up to date. Thank you all so much. Bye.